I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare Anyone? Hi, listeners. Elyse here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Kourtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Kourtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Kourtney.
Hi, Elyse. How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty well.
Yeah. I feel like Romeo and Juliet has gone by really quickly for me.
Same.
I kind of can't believe that we're already here at the wrap-up. And maybe we say that every wrap-up episode, but this one really flew by. Now it's like, oh, we're here. We're halfway through the year now.
I agree. I feel like because of things happening in life externally, like in the world, as well as like school, work.
Us literally not recording anything during the month of March, basically, because you were traveling and our Patreon patrons got to hear all about that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just, maybe that's also why, is that we just broke it up a little bit differently. And
yeah, we talked about some really great stuff, and I have so many new thoughts about Romeo and Juliet, but in some ways, because of like the pacing of this season in life and season in the world,
mm-hmm.
It feels like it went by in a flash, and I didn't get a chance to marinate in the season.
Yeah.
But luckily, there's plenty of time to continue marinating in the things we talked about. It just flew by.
Yes. So one thing that we've been talking about as we've approached this wrap-up episode is the amount of Romeo and Juliet adaptations and like adjacent content that there is out there for us to choose from, and that it was actually really a wide field that we had to narrow down to be able to have the time to watch what we did.
Mm-hmm.
So we do want to take a moment right now to acknowledge all of the really great adaptations, and maybe also not so great adaptations, that are out there that, we didn't have the time to get to this time around.
Yes. I tried to look up a list of Romeo and Juliet adaptations, and I was led to Wikipedia on a little subheader thing that was called List of Films Based on Romeo and Juliet, and there were over 125 or so results on that particular list, and that was film adaptations. That doesn't include all of the iterations that were done on stage and production, and it also didn't include the adaptations that are named something different,
mm-hmm.
but still are the story. So really, we had so much to choose from. And some examples of those were the Franco Zeffirelli 1960s film. There are also adaptations like Romeo and Juliet, Rosaline, and Shakespeare in Love that we talked about on Patreon. You can check out that bonus content on Patreon. I just recently saw the Globe Education's collaboration with Deutsche Bank, a school outreach production of Romeo and Juliet. If it's on the Globe Player, I highly recommend watching it. Of course, there's West Side Story and other adaptations that are Warm Bodies, that are the story, but not.
Right.
One that I saw that is not honorable, I just came across it, and there are two examples in my mind of bad adaptations. One that I saw that I haven't seen, but I saw the trailer, and in this geopolitical moment, rubbed me a horrible way. It's called West Bank Story, which is a 2005 short about Israel versus Palestine, and the conflict is that they're feuding falafel restaurants, and reminded me of the production that was supposed to come out a few years ago, and then the internet was like, no, you can't do this, but the Nazi and Jewish production concept that was that's disgusting.
Yeah, the thing that I think we should highlight, and as we talk about adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, is that the feud is supposed to be something that nobody remembers why they're fighting. By that means inconsequential. Romeo and Juliet is one of the plays that is most commonly a victim of the bumper sticker Shakespeare concept, where a concept is not fully thought through. And in the case of Romeo and Juliet, there have been occasions where the concept of the plot point of the feud is applied to situations that are much bigger than feuds, whether that's the sides of the United States Civil War or any sort of opposite sides of a war. It becomes really inappropriate really quickly for the world of Romeo and Juliet,
totally.
Because it places the forbidden love story in between and into a place where the families are actually not both alike in dignity. They are on opposite sides of a war, often about human rights. So
thank you, Elyse, for clarifying that, because when I saw West Bank Story, when I saw the Nazis versus the Jewish people feuding families years ago, that sensitivity, those things that you spoke about, do need to be taken into account when producing Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
Because of the consequences and the large scale circumstances and histories and contexts. Yeah.
The point of this play is that young people die because of a feud that is at the core of it. The reason is forgotten, and somewhat trivial reason why they started fighting, but they can't remember why they started fighting. Therefore, it can't be war.
Yeah, totally. War, occupation, civil rights,
yes,
those sorts of things, human rights, should not be considered when doing this play or an adaptation.
Great adaptations. Alternatively, if you want to have sides that you can connect to something that exists in the modern context, are sports rivalries.
I knew you were going to say that.
Give us a Red Sox versus Yankees. Give us a Patriots versus Cowboys. Give us Giants versus Dodgers. Because at the end of the day, the grown-ups in this play need to be able to say, yeah, we shouldn't be killing each other over this. We shouldn't be having violence over this. And the young people end up dying anyway. Right.
Yeah. So to wrap up this aspect, this part of the conversation, please think through your choices when you adapt Romeo and Juliet. Okay. And the last thing I want to bring up, only because of the current time that we're in, I haven't read this yet, but I also saw that there was a book called Teaching Romeo and Juliet in Palestine, Teaching Occupation, about teaching English literature to students in the occupied territories. And I just wanted to throw that out there, given the current climate.
Well, shall we dive into the first adaptation that we will be discussing on our episode? We mentioned that we will not be covering the Zeffirelli film. And the reason why we chose to not discuss the Zeffirelli film is because in recent years, the young actors who were underage at the time of filming have come out and said that looking back, they do not feel like they were given the opportunity or were fully able to consent to the nudity in that film. And out of respect for them, we chose to not look at the Zeffirelli film, although we really will acknowledge that it has a great Tybalt.
Yes, a fantastic Tybalt. And
in Michael York. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. We were just on the same page when we brought this adaptation, this film to the table, where it's ethically the correct thing to do to let this one live in the past and support the actors who felt victimized during their time on set.
Right. What we will talk about, however, is Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which is possibly the other of the adaptations of Juliet. Those two are probably the most well-known adaptations of Juliet. So we are going to be diving into Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet, or Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet. This film was directed by Baz Luhrmann, and then it was written obviously by William Shakespeare, but the screenplay was by Baz Luhrmann and Craig Pearce. The cast features Leonardo DiCaprio as Romeo, Claire Danes as Juliet, John Leguizamo as Tybalt, Harold Perrineau as Mercutio, Pete Postlethwaite as Friar Lawrence, Paul Sorvino as Lord Capulet, Brian Dennehy as Lord Montague, Paul Rudd as Paris, Vondi Curtis Hall as Prince, Miriam Margolyes as the nurse, and Dash Mihak as Benvolio, among others.
Yeah, huge cast with a lot of like standout actors.
Yes.
Yeah. And I will say, I saw this movie when I was in high school. I have seen this movie on and off over the years. And one thing that I do think is a really important distinction that I don't necessarily know if teachers bring to the table when they present this, but this really is, I mean, if you're familiar with Baz Luhrmann's work, he's an auteur. And this film is really a product of his creative vision, and it's not really reflective of Shakespeare's text. In ways it is, but it's...
In other ways it is. For a film that is titled William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, this is not my original idea. I heard someone else say this. It is maybe better titled Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, because it's very much a Baz Luhrmann film.
I agree.
As are all Baz Luhrmann films.
Yes. So yeah, let's dive in.
Yeah. I will say overall, there are parts of this that I enjoy, and then there are parts of it that like you, I saw it in high school. I've seen it a few times, and revisiting it, my opinion is not different. There are parts that I really don't like, but there are parts that I do enjoy. One of the parts that I do enjoy starts at the very beginning, a very theatrical device of using a news reporter to deliver the prologue.
Yes, I agree. I think it's a fantastic framing device. It's a wonderful way to use the prologue, and I appreciate that they wrap up the movie by coming back to the news reporter.
Yes, I like that it makes that circle. One thing that I don't love is that immediately after that, they then repeat the prologue in this sort of like movie trailer.
Yeah.
And it's, my partner said, this is very like sensory overload immediately. And it's like we had a theater beginning and then a trailer for this movie. And then we get into the movie.
Yes. I will say that with the second prologue, I guess I would call it, I do think it's neat that we are offered visuals, like visual information, just like the prologue that is telling us these are the things that will happen in this film. We see it, and it seems like the visual representation matches the idea behind the prologue, but I agree it is like overstimulation, and it's...
We could have had one. We could have had one.
Exactly. We could have had one. Pick one or the other. It was unnecessary. Yeah. And this film takes place in a fictional place called Verona Beach, which is a 1990s Miami.
Yeah, Miami or like Venice Beach.
Kind of Venice Beach.
Yeah, a little. I think a little bit more Miami. Yeah, somewhere coastal and warm weathered.
Yes, I skimmed a website about the filming locations, and I think they also filmed in Mexico City. So it's very like southern coastal.
Yeah. I do love how this movie starts with the Montague boys, and I think that they really create a wonderful set of like stakes for what this feud feels like for the young people in this community who are involved in the feud, and that there are people who are not involved in the feud. And the "Do you bite your thumb at me" sequence is just really well done, and John Leguizamo is an incredible Tybalt.
I agree. I love the rambunctious nature of the Montague boys, and then the Capulet. I don't know if they're called the Capulet boys as well, but the Capulets. It's over the top. It's also a bit camp, which is really fun. And in typical Baz Luhrmann nature, he uses, I don't know. I'm not a cinematographer, so I apologize to anybody who knows proper ways to discuss these things, but he makes things like rapid pace and then slows things down. And he uses
a lot of like quick cuts and then will do longer cuts to
create a sense of urgency of pace. Like he really
Yeah.
like keeps the pace and like tension through his cuts and his angles. And one way that he does that is you see Tybalt's shoes exit the car and you see him stamp out a match.
Yeah.
And then you see him walk into the gas station. And it's an incredible establishment of like, there's this other person in the Capulets that you're not seeing right now who has some sort of status because his shoes are different. And then you finally do see him.
And his shoes, the heels have cats on them. And I was like, yes.
Yes.
This film, I think just across the board, when we were talking about Titus and the like disconnect of the world, one thing that this movie does really well, whether it's Baz Luhrmann or the designers or the costumers, is across the board, the costumes, the sets, the locations, it all feels like they're all together. The world building is really stellar, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do want to take a moment and talk about the guns.
Uh-huh.
Because he chooses to make this a world with guns. And the guns are named things like sword, rapier, dagger,
Longsword.
longsword. I'm not the biggest fan of this choice. I think it makes it instantly silly, which if that is the choice to be, you know, as you said, like there's a campiness to this. This one choice for me feels like a step into silliness when we're trying to be serious for camp. And it kind of, I don't think it achieves exactly what he wants it to achieve, at least for me. And then down the road, it creates some plot issues.
Are you talking about like Mercutio's death and Tybalt's and the...
Yes, I am.
Yes, I have a note about that. That was something where we'll talk about this when it comes, but I agree that the gun selection over choosing like switchblades or something else.
Or having it be knives, having it be...
Yeah, knives, anything like it hindered the fight choreography, the potential of fight choreography.
Yeah, in such a really cool world, I think the coolest thing it does is it allows John Leguizamo and then later Benvolio will do these sorts of like gunslinger trick choreography. Yeah. But it does mean that in our moments of action, of violence, we don't get fight choreography that like we could have had it been a more martial weapon.
Exactly. Yeah, we're on the same page.
Yeah. I do like the way that Romeo finds out about the brawl is that there's a news report that he's able to see on a television. I think that's just, again, like this makes sense in this world. This is exactly how, instead of coming across it in a square and coming across whatever damage was done, he's instead seeing the modern news report that there was a brawl. And I was like, solid.
And on top of that, not just that there was a brawl, but the brawl had really large-scale consequences that, like you said, there are people in this world who are tired of the feud. Like the woman that's like hitting Samson or Gregory, one of those two, hitting him with a purse as the boys are trying to brawl. And it's just...
There's nuns and there's other people in this world, and that's really, really nice.
Yeah. I have a controversial opinion, maybe. I don't know. I actually don't like Leonardo as Romeo.
No, not really. Okay. I don't think either he or, and this is how I'm going to phrase it, I don't think either he or Claire Danes were given the support that they needed to succeed in these roles.
I also agree. Yeah.
Because I think that they are both good actors, fine actors even. I think that they do not always know what they are saying. And I think that there are times where they each have moments of like, oh, there it is. Now I see Juliet. Now I see Romeo. But it is few and far between, and it is really difficult to root for them, for me, or to care. This movie, for me, in general, is about Mercutio and Tybalt.
Yeah. Yeah. And even at some point, I really prefer like Lady Capulet over, like, she seems more invested in the world that is going on than Leo and Claire.
I love that Lady Capulet is kind of campy and comedic when we first meet her, when she is getting ready for the ball. She's so unserious, and I think so often she can be very serious. And I really liked the take that like she's just kind of not.
I agree. And it's a wonderful juxtaposition to Lady Montague, who we see in like select moments where her and Lord Montague are worried about Romeo, and then there's stuff about like the banishment and all that. But like the two families, the pair of parents, are very different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fun juxtaposition in this world where they're, I think, like rival construction companies or something
Real
like that.
estate moguls
Real
or
estate,
something
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to say, because we did talk about how Leo and Claire are not like at their best. Like, I understand why they were both cast in the 90s, but I do want to talk about like a couple people that I think are really excellent in addition to John Leguizamo, which is Paul Rudd as Paris. So good.
Yes. Yes.
And also Harold Perrineau as Mercutio is also quite good.
Yeah, I think that Mercutio carries so much of this. Like you mentioned, this is Mercutio and Tybalt, and totally. He knows what he's saying, he knows how to make it modern, and he's having fun. And yeah,
Mhm.
I agree.
Yeah. To give some pluses to Leonardo and Claire, I think that when they are not speaking verse is often when they're at their best. The meet cute at the fish tank is really sweet. It's a really nice way to have them meet and see each other before the lines that we get in between them at the party.
Yes. One thing I noted about the film was, and this is a visual thing, visually, I think that this film really strongly sets up the love at first sight connection between Romeo and Juliet with, as you said, the meet cute at the aquarium, as well as the scene where Juliet is dancing with Paris and Romeo is watching. And
Yes.
she's really making fun to Romeo behind Paris's back about, Paris's dance moves and all of that. And they're having this like eye connection, nonverbal moment. And I think it really successfully sets up the fact that these two are into each other.
Yeah. One thing that I did like was during what is commonly known as the balcony scene, even though Shakespeare does not write a balcony and there were no balconies in England at this time, he just says that she appears at a window.
Yeah.
So I do like that when he is in the garden and seeing her when she does finally enter, it is almost below him because he's climbed up a trellis and she is walking through a doorway.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what a great way to subvert expectations of that scene. And yeah, a lot of this becomes, for me, Mercutio and Tybalt have more chemistry than Leonardo and Claire Danes.
I think you're right. I think that Leo and Claire, on top of what we discussed with needing support for the lines, they don't seem like they, as Romeo and Juliet, are head over heels for each other.
Yeah. Rumor has it they did not get along on set, and it shows. If that is true, it shows. If not, then it's unfortunate that, yeah, they don't really seem that into each other once they are into each other.
Yeah. I read, and I don't remember what website this was, so I don't know if it's credible, but I read that originally Natalie Portman was cast as Juliet, but Baz Luhrmann decided that she would not continue on because she was 14 at the time and Leo was 21, and the age gap just made Leo seem too old and creepy. And then Sarah Michelle Gellar was also considered, but had a scheduling conflict. And Claire Danes was selected. I mean, she is, like you said, a fine actor, but she was also very genuine and wasn't trying to act very flirtatious. And I do appreciate that, like, about,
Yeah, I did. I think I read similar things. And again, like, to the extent that this is credible because it's on the internet is debatable. But I also read the same thing about Natalie Portman. And I read that, like, when they were screen testing, Leo did vouch for Claire Danes. And he liked her reading the best because she was not, like, overly flirtatious. And he liked that for Juliet. And I did read a quote from Miriam Margolyes that comes from her autobiography, where she does say that they did not get along, and she credits it to Claire coming in with a bit of a crush on Leonardo DiCaprio, and then Leonardo being essentially a young man who maybe didn't bathe as often as he should have, and who was not interested, who did not return her affections and didn't deal with it well, and so he was kind of rude to her on set. And then she ended up not liking him either. And according to other reports on the internet, he would say she was uptight and she would say that he was immature. So I think that there's moments where, having read these things, I saw some scenes where I was like, I know her first day on set was the scene where she has to be, where they are consummating their marriage and she is topless. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a bad practice.
That's a bad practice. That's not a great practice. And in that scene, that is the most chemistry I think they have, because they don't know each other that well. And by the time that, scenes that are filmed later, the personality differences, I think you can see.
Yeah, and it's a shame because so many people, younger, older, but primarily high school students, when they are first introduced to Romeo and Juliet as a play, they are introduced to this, and the dynamic that's built in this adaptation does kind of carry. And I don't think it's an authority on performing the play, but because it's like one of the first and it has popularity, it can then be seen as like a cultural authority on.
Or a touchstone.
A touchstone, yeah, that's a better way to put it. It can be seen as a touchstone for the characters.
Yeah. I think I'm ready to talk about Mercutio's death.
Yeah, let's move on to Mercutio. And I actually really want to bring something up about Tybalt that I've been thinking about between this and the other production we watched. And that is from our research on feuds and vendettas. I've been thinking a lot about and I love John Leguizamo in this role, so this is not an insult to his performance. But I have been thinking a lot about the way in which these characters brawl. And I've been thinking a lot about how Mercutio calls Tybalt a duelist. How interesting it would be to see Tybalt as he still wants to fight, but he wants to fight in the codified dueling culture of the Italian Renaissance as well as Elizabethan and Jacobean England. And it's Mercutio who's more of the
instigator.
He's the one who's really poking, and that's not an insult to any Tybalt who has played the way that I have usually seen Tybalt as the very aggressive young person. But I think it'd be interesting if his role was more of I play by the books and he's trying to restrain himself, and Mercutio's the one who's really scrappy, trying to fight dirty. What would that do to the relationship if Tybalt is I'm going to fight, but I'm going to fight by the rules?
Yeah, that'd be super interesting, I think. Reconsidering Tybalt as more it would be interesting to see a Tybalt as someone who's is there to fight, but is maybe a little bit more stuck up about it, stuffy about it, versus Mercutio being a little bit more wild, off the cuff, improvised fighter. Yes, would track with what we've researched, and I think would be an interesting take on the characters for sure.
And with that, let's talk about Mercutio's death.
Yeah. For me, this is not just where, typically where, the tone of the play can shift, and it certainly does, but it is, spoiler alert, that's this whole episode, is spoilers. Mercutio is stabbed with a piece of broken glass.
Yeah.
Again, in a world with guns, where Tybalt is the master, gunslinger, we have a mortal wound delivered to the abdomen with a piece of glass, and Mercutio is able to walk away, and then we never see him again. But he's able to walk away.
That poses as a problem for what follows.
And it poses a problem for what follows, and it poses as it makes the tone of that moment really off for me. The tonal shift that happens after that, I think that Baz doesn't execute it well. To me, it seems like this is a director who really knew what he wanted the first half of this film to be. And then when it got to this moment, he no longer really knew what to do with the actual tragedy parts of this story. This literal plague arrives in the clouds darkening, and it's Verona Beach is this dark place. It's very on the nose.
Yeah. As soon as this happens, an actual storm, rain, wind, darkness. Yeah, I did notice that too. It got incredibly dark. Not tonally dark, but it was broad daylight when Mercutio was stabbed.
Yeah.
And then as Romeo is driving off to avenge and kill Tybalt, it's pitch black by the time he gets to Tybalt.
Yeah. I want to get to the avenging Tybalt's death via car crash, which to me makes it seem premeditated, which I think the tragedy of the actual scene as written is that it can be a mistake. It can be Romeo says over and over he does not want to kill Tybalt. He doesn't want to fight Tybalt. And then to have him be so mad that he's chasing Tybalt in a car that leads to a deathly car crash seems premeditated, and it also puts a lot of distance between Mercutio's death and Tybalt's.
And it also was a strange choice because, so after the car crash, Tybalt crawls out of the car and is reaching for a gun that like flew, I'm assuming flew out of the car. And Tybalt gets the gun, stands up, and Romeo ends up yelling at Tybalt, and then Tybalt places the gun on Romeo's forehead and then decides that he's not going to kill Romeo. And that's the moment where the power dynamic changes and Romeo gets the gun and shoots Tybalt.
It kind of doesn't track with Juliet's lines later. If Romeo lives that Tybalt would have slain, and Tybalt's dead that would have killed my husband. All this is comfort, wherefore we by then.
Yes, yeah. Tybalt has this moment of hesitation and this like, and he steps back from this attempted murder. I think that Baz Luhrmann just didn't know what to do about choreographing an intricate fight choreo with something that is not quite as intimate as guns.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when this play starts escalating deaths, I think he knew what to do with the final death. I think he didn't know what to do with these two to make them not the focal point, but to make them still have stakes. I also want to just call out that there's a missed opportunity here. Going back to Mercutio's death really quickly, they are fighting on this abandoned theater on a beach. It feels very underutilized as a visual moment to have, you could have had the actor playing Mercutio die on
a stage.
Yeah. Or you could have had him and Tybalt left on a stage, and you could have it could have been a really interesting meta moment of like, remember, this is a play. Yeah. And these were young men, boys playing at being grown-ups, and they died. Missed opportunity. Just completely create this theater or this visual moment with Romeo at the beginning, and then like don't really use it again.
Yeah.
Romeo's line, I just want to say there are a few choices that rival Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet choices for me in terms of Shakespeare overacting. And I Am Fortune's Fool is one of those. And then for me, after Tybalt and Mercutio are dead, Friar and Nurse kind of carry the rest of the film in terms of who I'm interested in and who's interesting to watch for me.
Yeah, and they're really not in it like enough for those being the two focal points. I mean, rather than letting Benvolio be the one who goes to the outlands, they bring Balthazar in for some reason versus just letting it Benvolio.
Be Benvolio just disappears.
Yeah, he totally disappears. And
yeah, the second half of this movie is like, the more Baz Luhrmann cuts, the more problems he has.
And I did not like, and I have not checked the text. I watched it again this morning, but I have not checked the text. I don't like Lord Capulet manhandling Juliet.
That scene is often done with physical abuse. And we'll talk more about that scene later. I think that like making him, he seems like he's a bit of a drunk or an alcoholic. I think that's an interesting dramaturgical choice that serves this production. But I do think that scene can be done, and is too often done, with him becoming violent out of nowhere.
Yes. So yeah, there's the violence against Juliet, and then on top of that, Lord Capulet is pushing around Lady Capulet and Nurse. And much like the Ophelia Hamlets, why do we have to go towards violence against the female characters? Why is that the only solution that directors seem to gravitate towards?
Why is that the only outlet for male disappointment, male aggression, male anger, male rage in these plays?
Especially when the language doesn't say anything about being struck, about hitting.
There's no reactions to it. It's just like, why is that the default? It seems. I agree.
Yeah. Additionally, difficult for me because all of the actors are yelling over each other. I feel like Baz Luhrmann cared more about the visual representation of this play versus the language part.
Again, it just feels like there's parts of this play that he really likes and he really had great concepts for and really thought through. And then there are things that he just did not really care what he was putting on film.
Yeah, agreed.
There are choices in the second half that don't quite track for me because we don't use these devices at any other time. Or we, in the case of Juliet going to Friar Lawrence and threatening to end her own life, we cut her line about having a knife. With this knife, I'll help it presently. Why? Why couldn't she have had a little gun if this is a world where guns are knives. Knives are
Mm-hmm.
guns.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. That's a choice that was like, this doesn't track for me. And then we kind of really quickly get to Juliet's pretend death and her in the tomb. We completely skip Paris also showing up in the tomb and being present when Romeo arrives. That's just
Mm-hmm.
not here.
No. Well, in this world, the news and law enforcement know that Romeo is in Verona Beach before he even enters the tomb slash it's really the church. But they're all alerted to the fact that Romeo is here. He's going to the tomb and he like has a hostage. There's a hostage situation in this Romeo and Juliet world. And I think that the choice to have like the helicopters and the cop cars and the hostage really brings about the urgency of the moment. However, he goes in the church, the tomb, and no one bothers him for it being this very urgent, like, this guy was banished. He's come back. He's not supposed to be here. We need to arrest him. And then he gets to his location after putting a gun to a random person's head to find himself, to having like enough time in the tomb to give his speech and die without interruption.
Yeah, agree. And then Juliet wakes up before Romeo is dead, which I think of all of the choices of this movie that don't work, that are kind of like off text that don't work, this one kind of does. It's very cruel, but having her wake up as he has drunk the poison, it's heartbreaking that they both understand what has happened.
But the plan didn't work.
But the plan didn't work. Yeah.
Romeo is dying for real, for real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was an effective choice, and it's a very difficult choice to put these characters through emotionally.
Yeah. Maybe one of the more effective choices in this film, or at least in the latter half of this film.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then both Romeo and Juliet are dead, and for some reason, this movie made a montage of their relationship, which I didn't really need. They could have ended with just go to the news anchor that closed out this film. The montage kind of felt like a slap in my face, like I didn't know what I had watched over the last 2 hours. And that's a minor thing, but it's just kind of like, you don't have to show me the aquarium again. You don't have to show me them in bed again. You don't have to show me any of that. But I'm not usually a big montage fan. Like, there has to be a reason for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, there's a montage. The dissolution of the grudge is not really addressed.
Yeah.
And then they end with a news anchor concluding the film.
Yeah. Overall, I feel like it is not the best adaptation of Romeo and Juliet out there, but it's what we have.
I think it's a fun adaptation up to a point.
Yes.
It's a very creative adaptation.
I think I could watch up until Mercutio's death. For me, that is the part that I really enjoy. You know, campiness and some things being a little too on the nose for me. It's still very enjoyable. I think it's a great example of what you can do with Shakespeare. But I think that, yeah, it just kind of falls apart for me at the end.
I agree. I think what you said was right, that he had a vision for the first half and then was like, I have to complete this script.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Shall we move on to our second production that we watched, which was the National Theatre's Romeo and Juliet. It is a 2021 made-for-TV movie, which I did not realize when we selected it, that it was made for television over 17 days in the empty rehearsal and performance spaces of the National Theatre during the early days of COVID-19, as theaters started being able to work in person again.
This production was able to utilize some very interesting ways of looking at how to be in production.
Yes.
Yeah. So of course, I'm not trying to minimize the weight of the pandemic. I'm just saying, contextually,
this is an interesting piece of art that came out of this unique moment. Yeah.
And and I don't think that it would have happened if it were not for the global pandemic.
Agree. This is directed by Simon Godwin, and it is adapted by Emily Burns. The cast includes, I'm really sorry if I mispronounce anyone's names, Fiaso Akinade as Mercutio, Jessie Buckley as Juliet, Deborah Finlay as Nurse, Tamsin Gregg as Lady Capulet, Ella Dackers as Peta, Ellis Howard as Samson, Lloyd Hutchinson as Lord Capulet, David Judge as Tybalt, Adrian Lester as Prince, Lucian Masmati as Friar Lawrence, Alex Monioni as Paris, Josh O'Connor as Romeo, Shubham Saraf as Benvolio, and Colin Tierney as Lord Montague. Again, apologies to anybody whose name I did not pronounce correctly. As you were saying, this is a very unique piece of art that comes from the circumstances it was created in, because we start off kind of exploring what does it mean to make a production. The film starts with actors entering a rehearsal theater space.
Yes.
And starting in street clothes and kind of empty stage with props and sets around them.
Yeah. Rehearsal sets, rehearsal props, rehearsal everything. Yeah. The early stages of making Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah. And then throughout this, we get glimpses of or moments of fully realized production. And then sometimes we are back in the rehearsal space. And it's interesting kind of ebb and flow between those spaces.
Yeah. And if I'm remembering correctly, by the time we get really in the weeds towards the end of the play, we are primarily in like full production. Mm-hmm. So I watched like a behind the scenes, like a making of, and the director was talking about how like he's doing what you were talking about, but then like there's a certain point where as everything becomes more elevated and more heightened for the characters, so does the production value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I kind of tracked dramaturgically for it is that we really sort of enter this produced, more realized production once Romeo and Juliet meet. And then every time their relationship kind of takes the next step, we get kind of a more fleshed out world. So after they are married, we have like walls and floors and full costumes, whereas before we maybe had suggestions of costumes or like costuming that could exist in this rehearsal space or in a fully realized production. And then when characters are about to die or take a potion that makes it look like they're dead, when there's like moments of that violence or that moment of character death, we'll flip back from the fully realized world into the rehearsal space again, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
This is a heavily cut production. This script is very lean and it clocks in at just about 90 minutes, which is impressive. And I have definitely seen productions of Romeo and Juliet that have taken more than 2 hours traffic. So it was very refreshing for me to see a production that was really very lean with what they wanted to do.
Yeah, when I rewatch it, I want to have my text with me to take a look at what was cut and what that did to the production, to the story. Mm-hmm. But overall, like, it didn't feel, from my experience, like I was missing too much to know what was happening. They picked the tracks, the relationship tracks, the plot tracks that they really wanted to emphasize, and they really like leaned into elevating those moments.
Yes.
So it didn't feel as if they were struggling, like, oh, we need to make this an hour, 30 minutes. What can we cut? It was like, where are we going to take our time and breathe? Because also, you mentioned how lean it was. There were also scenes where there was like, there was so much breathing room for the actors.
There was extended silence, and it was beautiful. And the ability for this adapt, I want to give credit to the team that adapted and directed this, because I think sometimes the general of people producing Shakespeare can be precious with the language. And there are certainly some like crowd favorite, well-known lines that they just cut out of there because at the end of the day, we get the message. We get this, or we don't need to hear this. But the overall pacing of this piece, I think, really pays off for those difficult cuts they had to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so now let's get into like the plot points of this production and what was effective, what wasn't effective, and also paint a better picture for the listeners about like what we're talking about when we say it was rehearsal room to full production back. So the play begins, you said, with actors coming in as if they're like preparing to perform. And then the prologue is performed in a like, it was really 3/4, but like a circle of actors sitting around, and one actor was saying the prologue, everyone else was sitting like as if you're doing a table read, only it was like memorized, you know? So it was very minimalistic. And so like it feels like a literal rehearsal, like you were in the early days of your rehearsal through the prologue. And then the actors get up and disperse from the circle, and that's when the bite your thumb scene starts. And they just go right into it. But actors who are not involved in the action are still visible from the lens of the camera, either like looking at costumes, grabbing coffee, and then as actors need to come into the scene, they like enter and interact with the actors who are saying dialogue. And I will say, I'm very sorry to all the actors or some of the actors in the Baz Luhrmann film, but the acting is just exponentially better in this production.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was also like super raw. I think that like, well, we'll get to that later. Let's just go through like the things that happen.
We stay in this sort of rehearsal space for a while up until Romeo and friends put on their masks and go to the ball, which I will get to in a moment because I do want to talk about one other thing that is introduced very early on, and that is that Lady Capulet assumes the majority of Lord Capulet's lines. And Lady Capulet, again, is played by Tamsin Greig. And so that's something that is uniquely different. Again, they're just walking around with like some hand props, some sort of suggestion of costuming, but nothing that feels like elaborate. It's like they're wearing things that could be street clothes that the actors wore to rehearsal that day. Then when they go to the party, when Romeo and his friends put on their masks that they grab from a shelf in the rehearsal space, a rolling door slides up and additional cast members are revealed in this sort of like jazz rave environment. And there are people dancing, and Juliet is singing, vocalizing, which is how Romeo spies her initially.
Yeah, there's a really interesting thing that this production also does, which is it does incorporate like post-production music. And so in this scene, it's like rave music, I guess, like electronica. And as Romeo is first glancing at Juliet, it sounds like a heartbeat.
I made that exact same note too. I was like, oh, there's a heartbeat in these drum sounds.
Yes. And then I think that the heartbeat stops when he says a line and it contains the word heart. And then it gets dropped.
It's back to like a dance. Yeah. Josh O'Connor and Jessie Buckley, I will just say, have a lot of chemistry. They're very believable as a couple. From that moment, we move into a world that's kind of like halfway to full production. We have the balcony scene on something that looks more like a set piece than we've had previously. And the garden balcony scene has just so much excitement and young love in it that as we, again, some of the things I think we felt were missing in the Baz Luhrmann, we see between Josh O'Connor and Jessie Buckley.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I was watching I agree, they had so much connection and it was so raw and so just like they actually had feelings for each other. And it was this interesting combination of like, they were more mature Romeo and Juliets because they are older actors. But you're right, there was this youth, this playfulness, this flirtation that lacked in Baz Luhrmann's. But I do think that there was this also like maturity to the couple, which was really interesting because of their age, or I perceived it as maturity because of the actor's age. And I'll talk about that a little bit more too. And like we get to Juliet and Lady Capulet with the like, you must marry Paris.
Yeah. And then this sort of like half-realized production kind of continues until I think I tracked it at the moment that Romeo and Juliet get married. We kind of move into the next phase. So we've gone from this world where like we're in the fire cell, but like there's not really walls around him. He's kind of in a void and he's wearing a costume and he has props, but like the details around him are, for lack of a better word, fuzzy. Like they're not fully realized.
Yes.
And then we have this beautiful shot for the wedding with Jessie Buckley and Josh O'Connor in front of a bunch of candles. It's like a really beautiful visual.
Yeah.
And then from there, we start to see, especially as like Paris is talking to Lady Capulet about marrying Juliet soon, all of a sudden like the Capulet house has walls, it has floors, there are multiple rooms to it. So that's when we kind of enter this like fully realized production, with the exception of Tybalt, Mercutio, and Romeo fight.
Yes.
And that happens back in the rehearsal space.
Yeah, like backstage or something.
Yeah. And one thing that they also do through this film is as Romeo and Juliet kiss and are married, we also see Benvolio and Mercutio kiss right before they are approached by Tybalt, which I thought was a really lovely addition and choice to make for those two characters. And then Tybalt is there, and we are back in the rehearsal space. And as people die, and they use knives.
Yes.
It's very quick. And then when we're back in like Juliet's world, it's fully realized.
Mm-hmm. And she's approached by Lady Capulet about marrying Paris on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the Baz Luhrmann film and how violence was done upon Claire Danes as Juliet. You said you had thoughts about this particular approach.
I think it's just a really excellent example of how you can do this scene without resorting to violence. And that what I liked about Lady Capulet in this production is that I think people often struggle with Lord Capulet because it's like they try to make him more fun and easygoing in the first half, and then all of a sudden it's this big shift. And what causes that big shift? And what I liked was that throughout, Lady Capulet was cold and distant as a mother, and
even to Tybalt, it was very much like a my way or the highway. This is my roof. Yeah, you're under my roof.
Yeah, this made this interaction less about how dare you undermine me and like I'm going to physically hurt you into submission. It was more, these are my rules and you either do what I say or you're out on the street, and that's enough. I don't need to do anything else. And it kept the Lord Lady Capulet status in a really nice way, where I think that resorting to violence often makes Lord Capulet lose status.
Yeah.
Especially thinking about the end where this person's still going to be sad that their child is dead.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the ways that this Lady Capulet kept status was like everything was in her eyes and her tone. Mm-hmm. And I think she like sat down on the bed and was looking up at Juliet, which tells you that even though she was staged at a lower status, she still retained status because of her demeanor and how she carried herself.
Mm-hmm. She didn't need to
loom
over to assert herself, and it created being just so calm and calculated about it, and so matter of fact, kept that status established.
Yes. Yeah. And then Juliet was the one who like tried to run and leave and
just got overcome and
yeah. But Lady Capulet didn't put hands on and
kind of just was like, you're ridiculous.
Yeah, these are the rules.
My way or the highway.
Yeah.
That's how this works. Which again, it tracked from the party with Tybalt through this scene, and it didn't feel like there had to be such a shift for this character. This is who this person is.
Yeah.
And then we do go back to the rehearsal space for Juliet to when she takes the potion from the friar.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're back to a world where like all the other actors are watching her perform this, and we have this idea of like, again, like we are putting on a play. What is performance? What is production? And then when she's found, we're back in the fully realized world until the tomb, like halfway in between both worlds space.
Yeah, like we're returning to the process, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And Romeo takes the poison. He dies. Juliet wakes up and kills herself. And they are both laying in the tomb, the rehearsal room tomb. And during the final prologue, Prince's final prologue, the camera like zooms out, backs away, and like the entire cast is in this kind of vignette around the two bodies, the two lifeless bodies. And all of their attention is on the two actors. But then the play ends.
Yeah. I felt like this was really effective. I felt like it was well acted. I was like, this feels like it could be, this is a great alternative to the Zeffirelli or the Baz Luhrmann films.
Yeah, I agree. I really, really, coming from Baz Luhrmann to this, I really enjoyed like how much care was taken to what was being said, how it was being said, what we're including, what we're leaving out, but also like that's not a deficit. That's just allowing more time with the things we choose to keep in.
Yeah. For example, this is a very serious Romeo and Juliet. There's not really any time spent on the levity of the first half of this play and the comedy that's there. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work. I think this is what people think of when they think of Romeo and Juliet. Again, speaking very generally.
Yeah. And in comparison to the Baz Luhrmann film, this production offers so much space for things to breathe.
Yes, which is incredible in 90 minutes.
Exactly. You just get to sit in these moments with these actors, and it doesn't feel like it's too slow. It doesn't feel as if you're missing something, but you really just get to sit in the humanness of Romeo and Juliet, I suppose.
Yeah.
So overall, Baz Luhrmann, how do we feel?
The first half is fun, but it takes a turn for the worse, and it's kind of hard to sit through overall.
I agree. A better way to talk about Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is to just call it Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet, and to take it as a model of creative potential.
Yeah. And then I think that if we're looking for a good version of Romeo and Juliet that is on film, the National Theatre's 2021 production is pretty good.
Yeah. I think I would agree with the sentiment you had earlier. When we're showing productions to students, why not go to the National Theatre's 2021 production? Yeah, it does so much that the Zeffirelli does, and it's short and sweet and compact. And it's also really cool to get students thinking about what is being in production.
Yeah.
If there are any that we missed, well, we know there are some that we missed, but if there are any that we missed that you want us to talk about, please join us on Patreon,
where we have already talked about the films Rosaline and Romeo and Juliet,
as well as Shakespeare in Love, and had a book club episode with Evelyn Skye where we discuss her book adaptation, The 100 Lives of Juliet. So if you would like for us to watch and discuss more Romeo and Juliet adaptations, please join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
The link is in our episode description. Thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone.
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, follow us on Instagram at Shakespeare Anyone Pod, or Twitter at Shakespeare Anyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Love's Labour's Lost, Act 5, Scene 2, said by Boyett. Arm, wenches, arm!